Hello and either welcome or welcome back to the Gender Libertarian Podcast. If you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and on my Patreon page. Okay, so today I'm talking to Cathy Young, who is a freelance writer. She's written for many, many wonderful publications, including Reason, but also now more recently for Arc Digital. And that's kind of where I want to start because we're going to be talking about one of her latest pieces for Arc Digital. And I want to start off by saying something that I never thought in a million years I would ever say, and that is that I have missed discussing intersectionality and modern feminism.
Oh, wow.
Never thought I would ever in a million years miss that topic, but it almost feels quaint now with everything else that's gone
Yeah,
on. But
isn't it? Yeah, I know.
like everything's just gone to hell. So let's talk about some of the old stuff. It almost feels like a throwback.
I know, right. We can have our own little time warp here.
Yeah. But it is kind of relevant again because in our current
Oh, yeah,
situation,
yeah.
we're kind of having the discussion about race and gender again and how things are kind of shifting around a little bit. So the piece that you wrote for Arc Digital, Feminism, Racism, and the Damsel in Distress, kind of explain the idea behind that piece.
Well, I was basically looking at the story that was then sort of developing, the story that was kind of really at the beginning of our current sort of moment of racial reckoning, or whatever you want to call it, which was the Amy Cooper, Christian Cooper story. This is the woman in Central Park, New York, who had a confrontation with a guy, an African American guy, about her having a dog that was off a leash. And eventually, at some point during the confrontation, she was upset that he was filming her, and she threatened to call the police on him. And it was really sort of extraordinary because she actually specifically mentioned race. Because in a lot of these sort of viral racism videos, there's sort of the question of, was there really a racial element to this? And here she specifically says, I'm going to call the cops and say that I'm being threatened by an African American man. She says it twice, and then she actually also mentions his race when she does call the police. And it was this story that became really huge. And the woman, the man's sister posted this on Facebook. And Amy Cooper ended up losing her job. She's a financial advisor. And she just sort of became this infamous person. And it also sort of fits with the Karen meme that is currently very popular. This is the sort of obnoxious, entitled white woman who uses her privilege, to enforce her preferences, and has a huge sense of entitlement, and I think sometimes it's just sort of used as a synonym for this sort of entitled and sort of racist middle class white woman, and Amy Cooper sort of became the symbol of the Karen, and it just became this really fascinating story in many ways. And there were several articles that I mentioned. There was an op-ed in the Washington Post, and I think that there was also one in the New York Times about sort of the way that all of this ties into white womanhood, and basically the way that white women have sort of historically used the image of victimhood to assert power over Black men. And then there was a really interesting piece that kind of gave me the impetus for writing this, by Professor Aya Gruber in Slate. And Aya Gruber has a new book out on feminism as a factor in mass incarceration. And her argument was, which I thought was fascinating, that it's really not only about race, that, yes, obviously race was a factor in this, but there is also a history, like even apart from race, of middle-class white women sort of using the police as a weapon in controlling male behavior in general, especially sort of lower class male behavior, and especially non-white men. But really, she sort of ties this into the expansion of domestic violence law and just generally, again, sort of the use of the police by white women as a kind of tool of asserting power. And I thought that was a really, really interesting point. And and I think there can be definitely a debate on, is Aya Gruber, for instance, taking this argument too far? Is she sort of implying that it's wrong for, women victimized by domestic violence, for instance, to call the police? But, I do think that there's a really interesting dimension there, which really hasn't been discussed very much in kind of mainstream feminism, of, looking at the ways in which what I guess we call benevolent sexism, which is sort of the idea that women deserve special protection from violence and, from danger and from other things. The way that plays into, some feminist policies or, some feminist influenced policies, like the expansion of domestic violence law, to the extent, for instance, that, a lot of people have argued that restraining orders are sort of routinely used in divorce cases, not necessarily always by women, but, more often by women because women have more credibility as victims. And, there's been a lot of discussion on this in the legal community, including among, female attorneys. There was a piece written about this in the newsletter of the Massachusetts Bar Association, by Elaine Epstein, an attorney who is, certainly not some, anti-feminist person, who was at the time a past president of the Massachusetts Women's Bar Association. And she basically wrote that, in Massachusetts, which has a very, very strong law on restraining orders, this has become a sort of very common strategy in divorce cases, where essentially restraining orders are granted usually to women pretty much upon request or, upon a statement that, you're afraid of your soon-to-be ex-spouse. And that this is used as a tactic in divorce and child custody cases. And it was interesting that the title of her piece, by the way, this is Elaine Epstein of the Massachusetts Bar Association, the title of her piece was Speaking the Unspeakable. So even at the time, this was a hugely controversial topic. And so that I thought was really a kind of interesting connection between the two. So sort of going from this argument, this sort of intersectional feminist argument that, white women are not necessarily, always innocent victims of the patriarchy, and, that they historically have sort of used their status as these morally pure victims to really deploy sort of white supremacy against black and brown men. And sort of, expanding that to the possibility that the same leverage can also be used against white men, which really complicates the intersectional argument, of course, because in the intersectional framework, white men really, cisgender, heterosexual white men especially, can never be victims of oppression, certainly not by anybody who kind of ranks lower on the pyramid. Or, in the hierarchy. So I think that is a very interesting framework to explore. And that was what I wanted to do in this piece.
Yeah, and I just ordered Gruber's book last night, and I'm really excited to read it. But something that you noted in the piece, and I hadn't thought about it in this way before reading it, but now that I read it, I kind of wonder why I didn't. And that's, you pointed out how Amanda Marcotte, when we're looking at the Cooper v. Cooper case, that
Oh, yeah.
basically that in this situation, and this is something that intersectionality has had an issue with for a long time, with this kind of uncomfortable ease of which do we prioritize, race or gender. Basically, Christian Cooper gets the points here because he's black and Amy Cooper's white. So it's like at this moment, race has superseded gender as the top
Right.
thing in intersectionality.
Yeah, it's a fascinating situation, really, because you can point to other instances in which gender definitely superseded race. There was, for example, a number of people pointed out when the movie The Hunting Ground came out. This was the documentary about sexual assault on campus. I believe that in three of the cases that they profiled that had a named perpetrator, the named perpetrator was African American. And this was pointed out, I think, by Emily Yoffe, who is a critic of the film. And it was just interesting that this is something that completely, bypassed the attention of all of the progressive media that just gave this movie unrestrained or, unqualified accolades. This is in 2015. This is a movie that was nominated for an Oscar that just got really glowing coverage everywhere. And again, this angle of race just got completely unnoticed. And other people have pointed out that in many of the cases in the debate about Title IX, and the campus sexual assault, issues, and the battles over that, where many people have been arguing that the policies that were instituted under the Obama administration at the beginning of the decade really led to an abridgment of due process for students who were accused of sexual misconduct. And there have been many claims that these cases do actually tend to kind of disproportionately have Black male defendants. I've come across cases. There was a kind of fascinating case that I wrote about last year. It was sorry, not last year. It was the year before that, in 2018. I wrote about a case that unfolded at Yale, in which there was a kind of one of those very messy kind of alleged sexual assault stories where the claim of sexual assault rested on the woman saying that she was basically too drunk to consent. This was on Halloween, and she basically went back to the guy's dorm room after a Halloween party, and she claimed that even on her way to his room, she was so drunk that she could barely stand up. Apparently, that is not at all what showed up on the security camera footage, and she was she could be seen walking with a guy and smiling. So there was a lot of question about how much of it was just her sort of not remembering things because she was intoxicated, but she was at the time in possession of her faculties, apparently. So anyway, the guy was acquitted in criminal court in New Haven. And because in that case, she did go to the police, and there actually was a court case that ended up, being resolved in the guy's favor. And there was huge pressure from the kind of progressive activist community on campus to nevertheless expel him from the university. And the detail that was kind of interesting is that the man in the case was a refugee from Afghanistan. And there was actually a detail that I thought was kind of mind-boggling, which is that in the police notes from the initial interview with the woman, there was a comment from her that was rendered in the interview notes by the police as this is her speaking about the accused. Something like Muslim from Afghanistan, and then in parentheses, violence accepted. So she clearly said something to the effect that basically, like, this is a guy who thinks that violence is normal because he's a Muslim from Afghanistan. And it just kind of blew my mind that this is something that really didn't come up at all in the discussions of this case on campus, where you have normally you have people being incredibly sensitized to any sort of racial or religious bigotry, especially toward Muslims, who are seen as one of the victimized classes, especially in the wake of the Muslim ban, which this actually would have been pretty close in time to the original case. And this is something that just got completely overlooked. And I thought that was fascinating. So sometimes you get, when the focus of the case is on gender, race often tends to fall by the wayside, and vice versa. So it's really interesting, because this is something that I've been thinking about just generally about the whole sort of intersectionality framework, the idea of intersectionality, which does, by the way, have certain, I'm a critic of the sort of intersectional dogma, but I do think that if we're talking about, the idea that the way that people interact or the way people are treated is often influenced by, both race and gender and, other factors like, disability, et cetera, class, obviously that's true. And, very often there is a kind of interaction of these different factors. But what really kind of fascinates me about the way that intersectionality tends to be applied in practice by the people who talk about it, by the progressive activists, it's really not so much let's look at the way that all of these different factors interact in this case. No, it tends to be we're going to choose one dimension of this, social hierarchy, and then frame it entirely in terms of that dimension. So basically intersectionality means that in some cases, the white woman can be the oppressor because, her gender puts her in, her race puts her in a position of power, even, despite the fact that, allegedly she is oppressed as a woman. But when you have this this dimension kind of treated as foremost, the dimension of race, then gender tends to go completely by the wayside. So you're really only looking at it through one lens. When it's approached as a case of gender-based violence, then all of a sudden we're completely losing sight of the racial dimension in many of these cases. And the issue of racial prejudice, like in this Yale case that I mentioned, is completely overlooked. And then, when we have something like the Cooper versus Cooper case, I think that you can sort of legitimately make the case that, maybe Amy Cooper really was scared when, she's in this isolated area of the park. And I should mention, because by now people have probably forgotten the details of that case, Christian Cooper said something to her that I think could have been legitimately perceived as a threat. I'm trying to remember the exact words now, but what he did was when she refused to leash her dog, he said something like, well, if you're going to do what you want, I'm going to do what I want, but you're not going to like it. Now, what he meant was that he was going to give her dog a treat, because apparently he's an avid bird watcher, by the way, and apparently this is like what he does when people refuse to leash their dogs. Like, his tactic is to offer the dog a treat, and then he says that, people get upset about, a stranger offering a treat to their dog, so then they leash it to, like, keep the dog from running to him to get the treat. And by the way, some people have been claiming, and I don't know whether, that was the thing that was in Amy Cooper's mind. Some people have been claiming that, this could have been easily perceived as a threat to poison her dog. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's what she was thinking. But, I think you could certainly argue that if you're a woman of, fairly small stature, with a small dog, so this is not like she had a huge dog that, could have been, seen as protection. And there's a tall guy who is telling you that he's about to do something that you're not going to like, because you're not complying with his request to leash your dog. I think, under other circumstances, if this didn't have a racial angle, I think that, somebody like Amanda Marcotte would have probably been saying that, this is a woman who is legitimately feeling threatened because, a woman in an encounter with a man always has a sort of awareness in the back of her mind, or even maybe not so far in the back of her mind, that she may be assaulted sexually or physically or whatever, or possibly even murdered. I mean, we've had people like Amanda Marcotte basically argue that any time that, a woman gets, wolf whistled by a guy in the street, she is probably, she has a legitimate fear of rape. So I think from that standpoint, I think it's really kind of interesting that in the progressive, chorus of denouncing Amy Cooper as this evil woman who was, trying to get this guy killed, supposedly, by calling the police. There was a complete lack of consideration for the fact that, again, from their standpoint, from the standpoint of the brand of feminism that these same people have generally embraced, the threat of male violence is this omnipresent thing in women's lives. And if you're looking at it from that perspective, why wouldn't you say that it was completely illegitimate for Amy Cooper to feel completely terrified? And by the way, I've heard a fascinating theory about Amy Cooper's sort of invocation of race in that situation, which kind of makes sense to me, which is that basically she's coming sort of from a place not so much of the sort of traditional racism, so to speak, of, essentially like saying that, well, you're a black person, so, because of that I see you as threatening. The claim that I've seen is that she is really kind of approaching this through the progressive lens of believing that, the police are prejudiced against African Americans, and she's essentially threatening to weaponize like police racism against them, because she's assuming that if she tells them that she's being threatened by an African American man, she's going to get a more aggressive response from the police, or that he's going to be kind of more intimidated by her threat to call the police if she brings up his race, which I think is certainly still racist in the sense that she's kind of using his race against him to, make her threat to call the police kind of scarier for him. But it's kind of an interesting point that I've seen, that it also comes like essentially from this progressive, point of view about police racism. So, I think that's a kind of fascinating way of looking at it, and, very, very possibly true. Um, so yeah, but I do think that if you had the same kind of encounter involving a white man and a white woman, and this guy was, complained about being harassed by the woman, and filmed her while she's threatening to call the cops. If it didn't have a racial angle, I think it's very, very likely that the guy would be the villain in the story. And certainly people like Amanda Marcotte would be saying that, here's a guy who essentially films himself harassing a woman and then tries to make her look like a bad person. And by the way, a really fascinating story is unfolding right now. I don't know if you're following this Carlos Dillard story.
Yeah, I saw the video up on Twitter, and I'm kind of confused because I saw some people saying that this whole thing might be fake, but even still, even if it is fake, I think, in my opinion, it still says something about where we're at. Because if you look at the replies to the tweet, where people are like taking delight in this woman who may or may not be legitimately having her like address and her plate put out on Twitter for God knows who to find her, like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think this is actually, just a fascinating story, which is kind of still unfolding. And I guess for those who haven't been following this is a guy, this is a kind of internet kind of comedian, performance artist, and kind of, shady guy in some ways. Like, people are still trying to figure out, what his shtick is. Like, apparently he was like he's currently a sort of Black Lives Matter activist. Apparently a couple of years ago he was a Donald Trump voter, and was kind of disparaging the claims of police racism and the shooting of Philando Castile, who's the African American gun owner who was fatally shot in Minneapolis. And so Carlos Dillard, who currently lives in Seattle, posted a video on Instagram and then part of it on Twitter, where he confronts a woman whom he apparently followed home after she flipped him off, and he sort of told several different stories. Like, he said that initially he said that she cut him off in traffic, and then she, like, when he honked his horn at her, she flipped him off or something like that. And then he said that she was upset with him for not signaling that he was making a turn, and because of that she flipped him off. So he sort of told several different stories, but what it sort of boils down to is that he is accusing her of flipping him off in traffic, and because of that he apparently followed her home, and then initiated this confrontation, where he very aggressively confronts her, calling her Karen, by the way. Like, why did you do this, Karen? Like, what's your problem, Karen? And this woman is just, and he's filming her license plate. He says, by the way, like, this is her license plate, this is where she lives. And this woman is clearly just terrified. Like, she's hyperventilating, she's sort of shrieking, and she seems to be having this panic attack. And, I don't think it was fake, because apparently, like, people actually were putting out her home address in the guy's thread. And I would assume that if this was staged, like, she would not be at her real address. So, it seems to me like this is probably like a real thing. And there were people in his thread who were just gloating and, and making fun of this woman, claiming that she's sort of faking distress to essentially like evade responsibility for her actions. And then when a neighbor, like one of the neighbors who was passing by and sort of tried to intervene and ask what was going on, at that point he suddenly claimed that she had also called him a racial slur. Then suddenly it becomes this issue of racism, and he apparently he's also claiming that the mere fact of her, flipping him off in traffic as a black man, was essentially a racist act on her part. People have been pointing out that he has several other videos where he seems to initiate confrontations with, non-black people. I think there was like one that involved an Asian store owner who he also claimed had called him a racial slur. That was not in the video, by the way. So he sort of apparently seems to have a history of doing this stuff. And he's like, now he's basically like selling a t-shirt that is based on this confrontation. And so there's a very strong suspicion that he's doing this for self-promoting reasons. But, it's kind of interesting that this is a huge story on, in certain, sectors of Twitter. And unlike the Amy Cooper story, this has gotten really kind of zero coverage in the mainstream press. So, it's kind of interesting to me that, again, like right now, I think we're in a moment when the racial angle is the one that kind of gets all the attention. Because, under other circumstances, I could very easily see this being kind of, hugely blowing up as a story of like street harassment of women. Like, here's a woman who, gets followed home by a guy who starts filming her and, verbally abusing her because of a confrontation in traffic. And, and I think that if you kind of flip it around and look at the gender angle, you would kind of think that progressive feminists would be on this woman's side. And they're really not. They're being kind of awfully quiet about this, and I think that's really fascinating. And I'm very old-fashioned about this. Like, my solution is you really do need to look at the individual, regardless of, and obviously race and gender sort of factor into these things in many ways. But ultimately, I think you have to take sides based on, who's right and who's wrong. And I do think, by the way, in the Amy Cooper situation, I think that she was clearly in the wrong. I don't really necessarily believe that she was feeling that threatened by the guy so much as she was feeling just kind of annoyed because he was, telling her what to do. Because if you look at the Amy Cooper video, she's kind of advancing on him very aggressively. And like, he actually tells her 3 times, don't come near me, I think is what he says, or, don't come closer. So, she's like, if you look at her body language, she's pretty clearly the aggressor physically, despite being smaller. And, and I think people have legitimately pointed out that, when she calls the police, like her entire demeanor changes and her voice, like her tone changes from one of kind of anger and aggression to, suddenly she starts crying and she's sort of talking in a higher pitched voice and she's just sort of sounding terrified. And I think, it's quite believable to me that, she was kind of faking distress. On the other hand, this woman in the Carlos Dillard story, it seems to me really is sort of legitimately terrified. He's filming her license plate. He's essentially telling people where she lives, and I'm sure that he's accusing her of racism, and I'm sure that things are going through her mind, including the fate of Amy Cooper, who lost her job and became this complete social pariah because of this viral video. And and I think I do think it's a positive thing that we have not found out this woman's name. There really hasn't been, like, despite apparently several people doxing her in the Twitter thread, her name really has not become, like, I mean, I don't know what her name is. I'm sure I could find out if I tried, but, I have no interest in doing so. And, I think that that's a positive thing. But, I think that there really should be more media attention to the story, because I do think that these sort of viral racism videos are a very, very double-edged sword. There have been several cases where when we look at the context, and when the context emerges, it turns out that this is really not what we initially saw in a snippet of video wasn't necessarily, everything that happened. Like there was a story that I don't know if you're aware of, where this woman who was an employee at Chipotle was fired after a video that turned up on the internet that supposedly, like, showed her refusing service to a group of black men, saying that she's not going to serve them unless they pay in advance. And then it turned out, and there again, like, there was a huge outcry, and this woman got fired. And then I think 2 or 3 days later, somebody, like some internet sleuth, like, realized that something about the video felt off. I think he heard the woman say something about how they had been there before, and, like, he realized that this was sort of a continuation of some previous encounter. And it turned out that these guys apparently had a history of essentially being dine and dash thieves, and had bragged about it, like, in the social media, where they had a history of, like, getting meals and then running off without paying. And apparently they had done that at the same establishment, and this woman had recognized them. So, they were not being refused service because of their race. And this woman was actually offered her job back, but I think decided not to take it back. So yeah, I mean, I think that there is a real danger of these racism videos being weaponized, and which is not to say that some of them aren't quite real. And I mean, I can see the value in certain situations of exposing racist behavior. But I do think that there's a legitimate concern of, first of all, are we, like, turning every little conflict in everyday life into this sort of national story, and if you can find a racial angle in it. And secondly, are we getting the full context? And it seems to me that it's very, very possible for completely innocent people to get seriously screwed over by being portrayed as racist. And we've kind of wandered away from the theme of of intersectional feminism and race, but I guess it does all kind of fit in, because as we were saying, I think it's just interesting that there really isn't, like, the promise of looking at these encounters through an intersectional framework really doesn't seem to materialize so far, because it's like it's either or, like, either we're looking at things like this through the prism of gender, and sort of ignoring what may very well be legitimate issues of racism or racial prejudice. Or we're looking at this entirely through the prism of race, and ignoring what may very well be a legitimate angle of gender, gender issues and, gender-based intimidation.
And to bring it back to something that you had brought up on Amy Cooper's little phone call there, that sort of code switch that happened from when she was talking to Christian Cooper to when she was talking to the police. And this is also something that you brought up in the piece, but kind of unpacking this cliche of female victimhood and how it can be weaponized in certain situations to kind of get your way in a way that's not 100% kosher. It's a bit manipulative, basically.
Yeah, and I mean it is a gender stereotype, but sometimes stereotypes actually are true. I mean, not about everyone, and I certainly would say that, like, if someone claims that all women do this all the time, that would certainly be misogynistic. But do some women sometimes do this? Yes, obviously they do. I mean, it's kind of like, if you talk about men being violent to women, it doesn't mean that, all men are abusers, but some certainly are. And I think you can talk about the fact that, just like men sometimes do use their advantage and physical strength and, size and muscle and so on. I think women, partly for cultural reasons, I think it do indeed weaponize victimhood. And I think it is very kind of narrow and reductive to suggest that this happens only in cases involving race. I mean, yeah, certainly in some cultural contexts, in the Jim Crow South, there certainly was a kind of special status that was reserved for the white woman who claimed to be victimized by a black man. And, like, if we look at something like, the To Kill a Mockingbird, we see that, like, even the lowest status woman who's sort of, white trash and, comes from the, family that's despised by everyone in the town, even she can sort of claim status and sympathy if she claims to have been raped by a black man. So I think certainly in that cultural context, I think race is paramount. Where, the same woman, if she had accused, let's say, a higher status white man of rape, probably or almost certainly would have had a very, very difficult time having her claim heard in court, and would be almost certain not to win. But I think in the modern day context, I think that there is a way, and especially in the context of, ironically, of some of the legal changes and cultural changes that have been brought about by feminism. I think part of what's happened is to sort of expand the opportunities for women to weaponize victimhood against men. And it's not even necessarily only white women. I mean, we saw in the Duke lacrosse case that by the early 2000s, it was possible for a sort of lower class black woman who was an exotic dancer. So, somebody who, a couple of generations ago would be, seen as having no claims whatsoever, against a white man or white men who committed sexual violence against her. In the modern context, she can also deploy a claim of victimhood, basically for retaliation against several upper class or affluent white guys who with whom she had a dispute when she performed at the lacrosse team party. And, and I think it's certainly something that's useful to keep in mind in looking at the modern context of relations between women and men. I think it is important to recognize that, yes, on the one hand, it is a good thing that we've enabled women to kind of get a fair shake when it comes to being sexually victimized. And, we're no longer, sort of putting the victim on trial and asking about her sexual history and suggesting that, if she's sexually promiscuous, she, must have wanted whatever happened in this specific situation. But on the other hand, in doing so and in expanding these legal opportunities for women, we also have created, in some cases, the danger that, innocent men may see this power wielded against them and may really kind of have their lives devastated. And like even those guys at Duke University who were essentially like, affluent, white college students at Duke University, who were on the lacrosse team, who were able to afford high quality legal help. They went through a really pretty terrifying ordeal in which they were not only kicked out of school, pending the resolution of the case, but they were denounced by everybody, and they were just sort of very, very widely presumed to be guilty and were trashed in the media. And, it eventually turned out to be really pretty definitively innocent. So I think that is something important to remember. And I think that if we're going to look fairly at relations between men and women, we have to remember that, when when we empower women as victims, this can work not only for actual victims, but unfortunately also for fake victims who may weaponize victimhood for, self-interest or retaliation or whatever. So I think, and obviously that doesn't mean that, we turn back the clock and kind of go back to the bad old days when women were having a very hard time getting their legitimate claims heard. But I think that we do need to be more aware of, the possibility of false accusations. And I think certainly something like the Amy Cooper situation really should raise questions about the kind of the believe women mantra. Because, here we actually see on video that this woman who, is a very convincing victim on the phone is actually not, is actually not being truthful. Like, she is claiming that this guy is threatening her. We have seen that is not what happened. And yet, she sounds very credible. So when we have this kind of framework in which, people talk about a credible victim, what does that mean exactly? I mean, does that mean that you kind of make an emotionally compelling case? Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. And we're actually seeing in this case that it's not. That, as you said, it's a kind of code switch. So I think that is something that really should give us pause in kind of making an absolute dogma of believing the accuser. And obviously, again, like the answer is not to say, well, no, never believe women. Like, women lie about rape all the time, and you sort of see that in certain segments of the kind of the men's rights, corners of the internet, where you really do see a lot of misogyny, and there's a kind of, the kind of presumption that, women are, evil, manipulative liars. And well, some are, some just like some men are, rapists and abusers, and some women are abusers in their own way, which often involves, less the use of physical strength than the use of manipulation, including weaponizing the police. So I think, the real lesson, I think, is just to be more circumspect in judgments of any situation until we know all the facts.
And kind of the other flip side, well, not even the flip side, but like the other component on the whole idea of female victimhood. And while we're on the topic lately of discussing campus behaviors that are seeping to off campus places, this is the one that really kind of scares me. And that's this idea that feminism is teaching women that all men pose a threat to them. So you do have these cases where the idea of female victimhood is being kind of weaponized to be used in a manipulative way, but then you also do have this situation where women can genuinely feel like every man is a threat. And that is the one, I mean, as much as we talk about how much the whole speech thing and what's going on in the media is dangerous, this is the one that's going to do the damage to society here.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there are a lot of things going on right now that can do damage to society, so I wouldn't zero in necessarily on just one. But yeah, I mean, I think that, and I've seen this playing out, like even before, because I've been following a lot of this sort of crazy social justice stuff for years. Like I first noticed it, and I think I said this on Twitter. I first started noticing this on Tumblr, yeah, like around I think 2013 maybe. And one of the things that kind of drew my attention, I remember that there was a sort of free form poem that somebody posted. That was basically sort of attempting to depict the everyday life of a woman. And like the whole idea was that like you're walking to your car and you're sort of clutching your keys in your hand, in case you have to defend yourself. And all you can think about is the statistic that 1 in 3 women will be raped or something. And I just thought, this is completely insane. Like the idea that you would be sort of going about daily life, thinking constantly that you have a 1 in 3 chance of being raped, which is really, because if you're talking about like being raped by a stranger in the street on the way to your car, I mean, your lifetime chance of that happening is probably really more like 1 in 100, because well, I mean, first of all, the majority, and it's even sort of been discussed by feminists that the majority of rapists are actually, usually people that the woman knows. We get into the definition of rape, and what a lot of these surveys use really very, very broad criteria for what they define as rape. A lot of it has to do with, again, intoxicated sex, that you may like retroactively decide that, it wasn't wanted. A lot of it may have to do with like feeling emotionally coerced. And it's interesting that if you do these surveys, with both sexes, you usually find that actually a lot of men will also say that they've had situations of, being emotionally coerced, or, in some way, kind of, pressured into unwanted sex. So, these statistics are really like very, very inflated, and it just struck me at the time that it's completely insane, like to inculcate that kind of victimhood mentality in women, And you've probably heard this concept of Schrodinger's rapist, as in, Schrodinger's cat. So it's sort of like, any, like the cat, like if there's a cat in a box, the whole thing, like you don't know whether it's alive or dead. So it's sort of like both alive and dead at the same time or whatever. So this is like Schrodinger's rapist is basically the concept that like when you encounter a man, you have no idea whether he's a rapist or not. So, like, presumptively, every man that you run into is a potential rapist. And it's actually really, like, in the context of what we've been discussing, it's really kind of evident to me that they haven't thought this through very well in the context of race. Because, like, if every man is a rapist, potentially, then it's actually entirely like reasonable for a white woman who sees a black guy in the street to assume that he may be a rapist and to act accordingly. So, I don't know how exactly this. Again, like the intersectionality doesn't really seem to apply very well in this case. Because again, like that whole idea is being processed entirely through the prism of gender with no thought given whatsoever to like how it interacts with race. But yeah, it's kind of a terrifying way to go through life. And, I think it certainly creates many potentially dangerous situations. It really just imposes this, and really, I mean, it's kind of disabling to women because if it results in like women not going to certain places, if it results in women being constantly anxious about being attacked, I mean, that first and foremost has a kind of deleterious effect on women and really prevents women from taking full advantage of the opportunities that they have. I think obviously it's true that women are more physically vulnerable than men, generally speaking. Women are physically smaller and weaker. That's a fact. Women are more vulnerable to sexual violence, generally speaking. At the same time, does this mean that you have to constantly go through life, thinking that you may be raped and murdered at any moment? No, not really, because generally speaking, except in certain high crime areas, your risk of that happening are pretty small. There have been several cases that were kind of very widely publicized and that I thought, again, were just, they were terrible cases, but ones that were kind of blown just insanely out of proportion in terms of their applicability to all women. Like there was one case, I don't know if you remember, this happened, I think a few months ago. I'm sure we're all getting a distorted sense of time because of just how crazy, the news cycle is right now. But I think this was a few months ago where a woman was murdered by a guy, and I think this was like a homeless guy with mental problems who called out to her when she was in a garage walking to her car, and I think he just catcalled her or whatever, or yelled some sort of like invitation to go out with him or whatever, and she ignored him, and then he basically followed her to her car and killed her. I think he either stabbed her or like beat her to death or something. It was a horrible case. But I remember feminists like basically saying, well, see, this is why we think that catcalling is such a serious problem, because when people say that a woman who gets catcalled can just ignore it, well, this is what happens if you ignore a guy who's catcalling you. Like, come on, and what is the actual risk in terms of actual percentage? How likely is it that a guy who catcalls you is going to follow you and kill you. I mean, it's probably fairly close to like the risk of being struck by lightning. I mean, I'm sure that we all face higher risks every day. Like your risk of being killed in a car accident, I'm sure is much, much higher. I mean, you probably have a higher risk of like drowning in a bathtub. So, and again, it's not to make light of this case, which is obviously, horribly tragic and, tragic for this woman's family and just, really, really terrible in every way. But at the same time, you really can't just, take that kind of very extreme case and, apply that to everyday situations. And I think there have been a couple of cases in which, women were murdered after turning down, after turning down a guy who tried to hit on them in a bar, stuff like that. And then I think there was a case where the guy like followed her outside and stabbed her. There was a case in which a guy in high school, I think, killed a girl after she turned down his invitation to be his prom date. And again, the narrative that you get is like, well, women are afraid to say no to men because when you say no to a man, he may kill you. And I mean, again, that is such an overwrought and, really ridiculous way of looking at these incidents. Because again, like by the same token, if you apply this in a different context, if you said, for instance, I mean, there have been cases of people getting like stabbed by a panhandler when, after refusing to give them money. If somebody says, well, if some conservative said, well, anytime you see a homeless person in the street, you're constantly aware, as a, law-abiding, affluent working American, you're constantly aware that this homeless person that you see in the street may rob you, and may kill you, rob you, rape you, whatever. That would be legitimately perceived as, this completely bizarre, hysterical, proposition that is, fomenting prejudice against the homeless. Likewise, I mean, I think people have no trouble seeing how completely overwrought and hysterical this is when it comes to illegal immigrants, where it's like every time that somebody either gets murdered by an illegal immigrant or, even like killed in a car accident where an illegal immigrant was at the wheel, you get the Trump type saying, well, you see, illegal immigrants, we're all getting slaughtered by these illegals, who are, invading us and, killing us and, running us down in cars and, whatever. And then you get progressives pointing out that actually this is incredibly rare. And then you get the sort of, well, even one is too many and so on and so forth. And, so this is the kind of mentality that very rightly kind of gets called out by progressives as, complete nonsense and hysteria when it gets applied to illegal immigrants. And yet when, you get the kind of the equally rare case in which a woman gets murdered by a man after turning him down for a date, you get this narrative that, women are so terrified of men that they, they don't feel safe saying no to a man. And I'm sure, I'm sure if you ask the average man, is it true that women don't feel safe saying no? I'm sure you would get an answer that, it would be like, not in my experience. I think that, most men have, vast experience with women saying no and feeling entirely safe doing so. I think I think really both women and men are very ill-served by promoting these kind of hysterical, kind of moral panic narratives. So, I think that that certainly goes into this sort of this weaponization of victimhood kind of mentality, because I'm really not sure that this is always necessarily manipulative. I think that in some cases, women really have been taught to feel that men pose a threat to them at every turn. And I think it's kind of interesting that, this message really comes both from the traditional kind of paternalistic mentality and the supposedly liberating and supposedly empowering feminist message. And, it's like everyone across the board politically is, teaching women to be terrified. And I'm kind of wondering, who benefits from that. I think in a way it is a power play by these ideologies, that because you really do have these competing ideologies of both kind of traditionalist conservative ideologies and feminist ideologies that vie for the role of protector of women. And I think that's really interesting. And, I would really prefer to see a more genuinely empowering kind of feminism where, obviously we're aware of the fact that in some situations women are, as I said, more vulnerable than men. And I think we have to recognize that. But I think we also need to take a realistic view of, for instance, the fact that if you look at crime statistics, white women especially are really the safest demographic in America. Like the lifetime risk of being murdered. I don't have the stats in front of me, but I think it's basically like for the lifetime risk of being murdered for white women is really the lowest of any group other than possibly Asian American women. And certainly, I believe, like, if you look at the overall gender breakdown, like, I think close to 80% of murder victims are men. Most victims, even like robbery and aggravated assault, I think male victims certainly outnumber female victims. Obviously, sexual violence is something that happens, much more often to women, although it's kind of interesting that I've seen the claim that if you look at sexual violence in prisons, you may actually get the result that, like, maybe overall, actually, if you count prison rapes, it may actually be true that overall more men than women get sexually assaulted. I don't know if that's true or not. I've seen those calculations. I take all advocacy statistics with a grain of salt. And those stats did, I believe, come from like prison rape, activist groups dealing with prison rape. So again, I think you kind of have to take that with a grain of salt. But I think it's very likely that we do tend to like underestimate the prevalence of sexual violence against men at the same time that we're kind of redefining sexual violence against women in ways that kind of makes it appear a bigger problem than it actually is, if we're counting like every instance of, like drunk sex that you may later feel ambivalent about. I think that's certainly a kind of vast expansion of female victimization. And, and I think these circumstances, like if we're talking about either being talked into unwanted sex or being like quote unquote emotionally coerced or being like or having like possibly unwanted sex because you're intoxicated, not like actually passed out, but like maybe your judgment is not at its best. I think those are situations where we really should be asking women to like take more responsibility. And I think it's kind of ridiculous to designate that as victim blaming. So, I mean, I think that if we're talking about situations in which you can like avoid having unwanted sex at no physical risk to yourself, then I really think it's on you. I mean, I think that you really should be expected, whether you're female or male, to like be able to stand up for yourself and say no. I mean, this idea that and again, and by the way, this also goes into like this inflation of danger, where people say, the argument that I've seen is that, well, women may have non-consensual sex because they're too scared to say no, because of course, if you say no, the guy may very well cut you into small pieces. Well, again, that really does not happen very often. And I think most women, I mean, a lot of the time, even like if you look at what these narratives of, having unwanted sex because you don't feel comfortable saying no, it's really not like, generally those stories don't involve women saying, well, I was afraid that he was going to physically hurt me if I said no. It's really more like I didn't quite know how to say no without like hurting the guy's feelings. And again, if you start asking both men and women questions about that type of encounter, you actually find that you also have very, very high numbers of men who feel in some sense pressured or coerced by women. And I think we should be able to discuss that. I mean, is it a bad thing to emotionally or, psychologically pressure someone into having sex with you? Yes, of course it's bad. Should we be like telling people not to do that? Yes, of course. Should we be calling this rape? I really don't think so, because I think in a way that really cheapens the victimization of people who really are like physically forced or threatened with violence. So I think that the kind of the victimization creep that we've been seeing is a very, very bad thing. And again, I think it promotes, encounters in which, female, well, both genuine fear of victimization and the kind of manipulation of victim status. I think both of those, as in the Cooper versus Cooper case, really can potentially pose a danger to men, especially, I would say, in many situations, Black men who really, are viewed with more suspicion by the police. But, it's really not just Black men. I mean, there is a lot of evidence, and I looked at those studies, that a lot of the time, the police, like in domestic violence cases, there really is a kind of presumption of guilt against men. And, interestingly enough, feminist literature, or even like literature that is used in training in many police departments, literature that is used in training cops how to respond to domestic violence cases, that literature that has been like compiled with consultation by domestic violence activists, often like using federal funds under the Violence Against Women Act, really pretty much tells the police to be biased against men in domestic violence cases, because a lot of the time, like the criteria for determining who the primary aggressor is in domestic violence is really pretty openly kind of biased in terms of suggesting that, like, if there's mutual violence, you really kind of have to presume that the man is the aggressor. And I think, I mean, it's often like not explicit, but But I mean, they will say things like, well, you have to consider like who has the power. And I think a lot of the time the assumption really is that the person in power is the man. So yeah, I mean, I think that there is just as there is a kind of racial bias in many of these situations, I think that there is a gender bias against men in looking at sort of male-female confrontations. I think, and it's interesting that, by the way, I've heard. This was admittedly years ago when I have a book called Ceasefire on gender issues that came out in 1999. So obviously that was a somewhat different time. But I remember that at the time I interviewed a couple of female police officers who had worked on domestic violence cases. And I remember that one of them especially basically said that, male cops tend to be, really, really kind of tend to have the chivalry thing going. And like they will just sort of a lot of the time just automatically presume in a given like situation where maybe both people have engaged in violence, like they will presume that the woman is telling the truth, and they will presume that the man is more to blame. And she actually said that female cops kind of tend to be tougher on women. so I thought that was kind of interesting. Again, I don't know to what extent the dynamic may have shifted since then, but it's really like one thing that I think is really fascinating is that when like in the wake of the Violence Against Women Act of 1994, which by the way Joe Biden was instrumental in getting passed. There was like one of the things that the Violence Against Women Act did was create incentives for like jurisdictions to have mandatory arrest in domestic violence cases, because I think like there were federal grants for the police, and I think to be eligible you really have to show that like you either had a mandatory arrest policy in domestic violence cases, or at the very least you had a kind of strong presumption in favor of arrest. And one thing that happened when those policies went into effect is that arrests of women in domestic violence cases just skyrocketed. I mean, they went from like 5% of the total, like of all domestic violence arrests, to like 25 to 30%. And then the response from feminist activists who had been pushing for these policies was to say, oh, like this is victims getting punished by the police for calling 911, and this is like victims getting arrested for fighting back. And this is really not what the research shows. I mean, research actually shows that a surprisingly high number of high percentage of domestic violence is committed by women. It doesn't generally cause as much injury. Although, a lot of the time it does involve like the use of household implements as weapons and, that sort of thing. Again, if you look at mutual violence, there's a lot of evidence that, it's initiated by women as often as it is by men, and it's really not primarily about women acting in self-defense. And yet, the response from the feminist community to more women getting arrested for domestic violence was really not to say, oh, well, it looks like women are like more domestically violent than we thought they were. It was to say, well, how can we stop women from getting arrested? So I think, again, there's this sort of convergence of feminism and benevolent sexism, so-called, which is, sort of sexism that favors women in terms of like paternalistic, chivalrous assumptions of, female vulnerability and victimhood. And the convergence between that and feminism, I think, is just really fascinating. And again, that kind of takes us back to Aya Gruber's piece and, the whole kind of premise of weaponized female victimhood.
I think at this point I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up because I could probably do like another 2 hours on this topic.
Yeah, I'm sure we could easily do that, especially with everything that's going on now. But, you know, we should, I think we've covered a lot of ground. And I really hope I haven't been like rambling too much. Because it's like, such a huge topic and it just has so many different dimensions. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating to just kind of explore all the different angles. So, anyhow, well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for being here and let people know where they can find you.
Oh, yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Cathy Young 63, and that's CATHYYOUNG 63. And you can also find me at Arc Digital, and the URL is arcdigital, ARCDIGITAL.media. You can also find me at reason.com. And, well, you can find me really in a bunch of different places. But, you know, if you find me on Twitter, and you can also find me on Facebook, by the way. But, yeah, if you find me on either Twitter or Facebook, you will generally find most of my articles. So, and I do have a website that I should get updated, but it's like at this time, it hasn't been updated in over 10 years, and I really should do something about that. But, you know, but actually it does have a lot of my old articles. So it's, if you're interested, it's cathyyoung.net. So that's it.
All right. Well, thanks for sitting down and having a chat with me.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So that was my interview with Cathy Young. Obviously, we covered a lot of ground there, so I hope you guys enjoyed it. I really enjoyed having that conversation, and I hope you guys enjoyed listening to it. I will put the link to the piece in question in the show notes so that you guys can go read it for yourself. And so, as always, if you did make it this far, thank you for listening. And if you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and on my Patreon page. Take care, and until next time.